So today we're going to talk about the notion of control, of when it's important to have, but in a deeper sense, when it's really good to just give up control. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. So psychologically, I think most all of us love to be in control. We like to think of ourselves as people who are in control in some way or another. We don't like to think of ourselves as out of control or with no control or lack of control. And indeed, the whole idea, I think, of progress in modernity has been an idea of growing control over the natural world, over the world around us, brought about by increasing amounts of knowledge, by the sciences, by technology. And so this whole idea of control I think, is very pertinent nowadays. And it's also very much bound up with the notion of the self. Because as control increases, more of a notion of self increases. These concepts tend to go together. In particular, what we control most directly we think of as ourselves. What we think of as me, basically. So what I can control most directly is, let's say, this body, is my mind. These are the things that make up me, who I am. And as we get outside of the me and who I am, then there are parts of the world that we can, let's say, control less directly, but still have a lot of control over. And those, in that sort of wider circle, is what we sort of think of as mine, the things that I possess, the things that I own. And those are things over which, culturally, legally, whatever you want to put it, I have the most control. I can do with what I will if I own something. So when we're talking about our direct control, our bodies over what we think of as me, there are going to be some things that are sort of in between here. Things like, let's say, a prosthetic limb where it's something that I think somebody who has used one for a long period of time, I haven't myself, but I can only imagine, is going to be something that over time you're really going to start to think of as part of yourself, as really me, more than just mine. Similarly, if you've been driving, let's say, a car for a long period of time, and the car begins to feel like an extension of your own body, it really does start to feel like me, part of who I am, is this car. It's more than just a possession. It's more than just something over which I have control. It's at least that, but it's something over which I have really direct control. And so that makes it feel more, it sort of gets in towards the center of this big sort of broad circle of what we consider me and mine. And similarly, what we don't control is somebody else's, is owned by someone else, is owned by the government or whatever, and or owned by nobody. And that is the stuff that we don't control so much. So these notions of control and lack of control go very closely with our concepts of what we consider me and mine versus others, belonging to others and other people. And these basic notions of control in an everyday sense are perfectly fine with, let's say, with the Buddha. I mean, if we're thinking about the Buddha, and we're going to get to some of his some concerns here in a moment, but in the broadest sort of most general sense that I've just been discussing, the sort of everyday sense of control, the Buddha has no problem with that. Insofar as we're talking about ourselves, well, the Buddha talks about right effort. Right effort being this ability to work on ourselves, to make ourselves better in certain respects, to lessen the amount of greed and hatred and delusion we have in our lives, and to maximize the amount of, let's say, kindness and wisdom and generosity we have in our lives. And these are ways that we can work on ourselves in ways that we have some control over ourselves, at least insofar as we can institute certain we can undertake certain kinds of practices over long periods of time that make an effect. And so that's that way of being in charge, the way we're in charge of our own betterment, let's say, over a period of time. That right effort, in the sense of the Eightfold Path, is a kind of control. Also, it's true that we have control, or at least we can exercise a certain kind of control in the Buddha's understanding over what we consider mine. So, for example, the Buddha talks to lay people about what he calls accomplishment in protection. The accomplishment in protection is the layperson's, the householder's ability to protect and guard their wealth, the wealth that they have accumulated ethically through their normal work, through their normal livelihood. And there's nothing wrong with that. And also, once you've accumulated this wealth, then it's perfectly okay. Indeed, the Buddha would say it's correct to act in certain ways to protect it, so that it doesn't get stolen, so that it doesn't get taken by somebody who shouldn't have it, so that it doesn't get frittered away. In other words, we're supposed for the Buddha to pay attention to our income and our expenditures so that these things can be balanced in the longer term, so that we're not spending too little and not spending too much. These are the kinds of things that the Buddha recommended. And this protection of wealth, therefore, is a way we can be in control over that part of the world over which we have some kind of ownership. But there's another sense of me, of I, and of mine that the Buddha had a deep problem with. And in particular, there's various ways of getting this across. One way of getting it across is to say this, that there is a deeper sense of self, of me, and of mine, which is in a way salvific. It's a way of sort of saving ourselves, a way of getting out of the pains of the world, of recognizing some aspect of the world, some aspect of reality that is our permanent self, that is the self that we want to be, or the self that we should be, or the self that we feel that we are, that is sort of permanent within us. And this is the self that the Buddha has a problem with. And as regards control, this is the self over which we supposedly have perfect control. So we can understand, if I've talked about this, this kind of metaphor of circles, the inner circle being the self, the outer circle being the things that I own and so can control indirectly. But if we get to the center of that circle, like the point at the center, that, at least in certain ways of understanding the world, is this sort of center of the self over which we exercise a perfect control. So, we don't necessarily control parts of our body perfectly, but we can control ourself perfectly. And this notion of perfect control goes together with the self in many kinds of ideas of the soul, of a permanent soul, both in the West and, for the Buddha himself, in other kinds of Indian belief systems that were around at the time, such as Brahmanism and such as Jainism. In both Brahmanism and Jainism, there was this notion of this eternal self, this eternal Atman, or soul, Atman being the Sanskrit word for the self, that lies within us that we have to sort of discover. And it's the discovery of this self, of this entity over which we exercise perfect control, that can allow us to be somehow saved, to somehow go outside of samsara. And that's the sort of thing that the Buddha was intent to show wasn't really correct, was not a good way to follow a practice. So in particular, in what's understood in the tradition to be the Buddha's second sermon, so the first sermon, we'll remember, is the sermon where he puts into motion the wheel of the Dharma, where he discusses the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. These are probably, it's unclear. It's certainly not, he certainly did not give the first sermon in exactly the form that we have it, but at least in tradition it goes down as the first thing he discussed with his first 5 disciples after attaining awakening. The second sermon, then, is a sermon about the self. And this is a sermon where he is basically tries to argue against or explode this notion of the self that is presumably, since it's so early in his career, we have to assume that it was something really on his mind. It was probably that he was brought up in one or another of these systems and had been studying them for quite a long time. The meditation practices that he studied before he attained awakening were either Jain practices or perhaps more likely they were Brahminic practices of a certain kind. And the practices of self-mortification that he practiced before attaining enlightenment were almost certainly Jain practices. So both of these systems, the Brahminic system and the Jain system, were probably very close to the top of his mind as, after attaining awakening. And the sort of thing that he would have said, wait a second, these things aren't, it's not only that they're not correct, but it's my understanding of the problems with these other systems that allowed me to attain the awakening that I attained. So what he does is to go through the world, basically, the world as we understand it, and to ask whether there's anything under our perfect control. And so what he does, his technique is to say, look, the only things that we know in the world are the 5 aggregates. I did a video about the 5 aggregates that I'll put a link to up above. But basically, the 5 aggregates are the first aggregate, which is understood as form, but basically we can understand it as physical things. It's the physical world. And that's the first aggregate. It's all the physical things that surround us, including our own bodies. And then the other 4 aggregates are parts of the mind. So for the Buddha, what we have are our perception. That's how we recognize things in the world. Their feelings. That's our innate sense that things are pleasant or unpleasant. We have our will, our volitions, so that part of ourselves that make us want to do things and change the world in certain ways. And we have consciousness, which is a sort of a passive way of viewing the world, an awareness, our sort of innate awareness that all sentient beings have. And so these 5 aggregates are all that we're aware of. There's nothing else outside of these 5 that makes up the world of which we're a part, at least for the Buddha. I mean, in other words, you can't find anything else. Everything that we see is one of these 5 aggregates, basically. So what he wants to do is to go through each of these 5 and ask, do we have perfect control over that? So you start with form. And of course, what we have the most direct control over is our own bodies. But we don't have perfect control over our own bodies. We have some control. We can decide to move our arms, let's say, but we can't make our bodies the way we want them to be. Certainly if we're injured, we don't have the ability simply to change ourselves into being uninjured. But more so, we can't stop ourselves from aging. We can't make ourselves beautiful if we're not beautiful. Now, we're going to think now in a contemporary context that there are things that we can do to make ourselves more beautiful. Perhaps we can go under the knife and have some kind of surgery. But I think the point is taken, that we have only very limited control over the way our body is, and we certainly can't do anything we want to with it. Switching from that to, let's say, feelings. Now, it's pretty obvious we don't have perfect control over our feelings. Otherwise, we would only have pleasant feelings all the time. We sometimes have unpleasant feelings. Sometimes our pleasant feelings go away. Those are things outside of our control. So we don't have perfect control over our feelings. We don't have perfect control over perceptions. Perceptions simply come to us. We open our eyes, we open our ears, and we perceive things, whether we want to or not. Now, of course, again, there are things we can do. We can close our eyes, we can stop up our ears, we can go to a different place, we can practice guarding the sense doors, which is a practice the Buddha recommends to people who are still on the path and have problems with seeing certain things. So there's certain places where if we understand that we might get greedy or we might get hate, filled with hate, hate-filled, that maybe we should guard our sense doors. But these are only limited kinds of solutions. In the final analysis, we can't completely control our perceptions. We can't control our volitions, our will, much as we would like to. If otherwise, we would only be doing skillful things that we want to do. Often, we find ourselves doing things that we don't want to be doing. We'll spend time relaxing when we know we should be out doing yard work or doing work on our job or whatever it might be. And afterwards, we sort of kick ourselves and said, if I only had if only the right willpower came up in me, and willpower is really more of a Western concept, a sort of weakness of the will that we find in the West, is something a little bit alien to Buddhism. The Buddha tends to describe weakness of the will somewhat differently. It's not so much that the will is weak, it's just that the will is misdirected. We will things that we perhaps know in our better minds are not correct, but we find ourselves willing them nonetheless. And so that's a way that, our own will is not under our direct control. And of course, there's a kind of a paradox of control here when we come to the will, because the will is what controls things for us, but I think we have to sort of experience that paradox for ourselves and understand that although all that we can do with our control is through our will, the will itself is something that is, has its own mind, if you like. And finally, consciousness is something that is not under our control. For the Buddha, there are, I would say famously, there are 6 kinds of consciousness. There's consciousness for each of the bodily senses, and there's mind consciousness. And these kinds of consciousness come and go depending on the parts of the world that are under our experience, the parts of the world that we see, or hear, or feel, or taste, or touch, or think about. Exactly the form of that consciousness, of that awareness, is again not under our control. It's simply the sort of thing that we're aware of at that time. So the basic idea here is that all that we know of are these aggregates. That is to say, all that we know of is the physical world that surrounds us and the contents of our mind, these different parts of our mind that we see coming and going. But we can see when we pay attention to these, particularly in meditation, when we pay close attention, we'll see that they're always changing. That they're always changing not under our direct control, that they come and they go. And that in that sense, not only are they always changing, but they're also unsatisfactory in some deep sense. That is to say, none of them is completely satisfactory. None of them stays the way we would like it to. It's always changing. And if we had our druthers, if we really could do things the way we would want them to, we would have them be permanent in the way we wanted it to be. We would only experience pleasant sensations, for example. And so what we see is, when we pay attention, that all the world, all the contents of the world for us are change, they're unsatisfactory. That's the way the world appears to us. And if they were really under our control, that is to say, if they were really our self in this ultimate sense that some of his teachers wanted presumably to say, we wouldn't have that. We wouldn't have a world that was always changing. We wouldn't have a world that was unsatisfactory. We would simply, we would simply control that part of the world to make it completely satisfactory, to make it completely unchanging in that way. But what is the case is that external causes and conditions impinge upon us, what we are, all that we are, in various ways, external to what we think of as ourselves, in ways that make these things change, that make these things unsatisfactory. And so these external causes and conditions impinge upon us, these external causes that are outside, not only outside of the circle of me, but also outside the circle of mine. They're the external world, they're everything. They're, sort of swamping the causal nexus of everything that's that I think of as me and mine, in ways that change it in ways that I don't want it to change. And so since these external causes and conditions, by definition, as I've said, are outside of all of what we consider me and mine, they're not who I am. They're not self. They're not me. They're not mine. These causes and conditions are coming in and changing everything all the time. They're causing things to arise and things to pass away, whether we want them to or not. And so what that is to say is that there's nothing in the ultimate sense that is me or mine, because everything is always in the control, if you like, of forces that are not me and mine. The causes and conditions, these external causes and conditions are always changing things. And so when we look around, we don't find any part of the world, any part of experience that is outside of this causal nexus. that is outside of causes and conditions. Everything is under causes and conditions. And these causes and conditions are impersonal. And coming to an awareness of the impersonal nature of causes and conditions is a route towards understanding non-self within the Buddhist tradition. It's also a route towards many things. That is to say, it's a route towards our giving up a certain kind of conceit about our own abilities in the world. Giving up with this notion that I am fully responsible for my successes, or for my failures for that matter, either one of those. In many places around, many of the more problematic kinds of arguments, at least in the contemporary Western or American sphere, have been with this notion that I am absolutely responsible for all of the good that I do, and so I can garner all of the profit off of that for myself, justifiably, because I'm the only one responsible. But once we understand this this nexus of causes and conditions, we see that idea doesn't make any sense. But similarly, of course, many of us may feel depressed because we feel completely responsible for some wrong that we've done, some mistake we've done. And similarly in that case, at the end of the day, the mistakes and the wrongs are due to a nexus of causes and conditions as much as to anything that we can take responsibility for. So in both of these cases, we can give up with this sort of conceit of being either better or worse than other people. It also helps us to not take things so personally, which is something that we all are prone to do, myself included. And one of the great practices, I think, of early Buddhism is this kind of practice of non-self, of becoming aware of the causal nexus behind things, and thus realizing that what happens in the world really is not personal. It's not about you. And so when we understand that, we can find a route towards taking things less personally, and as a result, getting less caught up in them, getting less emotionally caught up in them. So the Buddha's approach in this second sermon was really to highlight this aspect of non-self, that no aspect of the world, no part of the world is under our perfect control. If you look around, everything is to a degree out of our control. And so learning to relax around this notion of controlling things is part of our practice, our ongoing practice. We should definitely remember, as I said at the beginning, that there's an aspect of control that's perfectly healthy and normal and natural that we should, that there's nothing wrong with. And that is the aspect of control that is conventional, that is limited, that involves, let's say, right action, right behaviors in certain kinds of ways, right effort, and keeping a guard over our legitimate wealth, let's say. But this ultimate idea of control, this idea of control that makes us so rigid and take things so personally, that is something that we can try to get rid of. Now, there is a practice around this that I would say, we can practice all of this in meditation. Certainly we can pay attention to the way that causes and conditions are external to us, are relentlessly external to who we are, or who we think of ourselves as being. The most direct way to come to an awareness of this in meditation is very simple. And in a certain way, it's the heart of meditation, which is to say, when we sit down, when we close our eyes, when we pay attention to the breath, and we tell ourselves, focus on the breath, which is a way of right effort, of course. It's a way of controlling the mind, trying to control the mind. And what do we see? What we see immediately is that the mind is off doing something else. We see that the mind all of a sudden is thinking about something tomorrow, is thinking about something yesterday. We can therefore appreciate and see directly, moment by moment, the way that what is most intimate to us, our own minds, which presumably, if anything, is us, we have no control over. Indeed, a lot of the mind is just being controlled by external events, by memories of those that sort of pop up at random, seemingly, that we have no understanding of how those things pop up, but they just do, or by external events. We can be sitting and suddenly we hear a sound, and that shoots off a train of thoughts on its own. And that's the way the mind is corralled by external events that are not me or mine. And so all of these are ways that we can become immediately aware of the impersonal nature of the self, of this non-self idea. So I hope that that's been a useful, I would say, introduction perhaps, or another way of looking at non-self for you, and the way that control or lack of control gets at what that non-self idea really is for the Buddha. So thanks so much to all of you. Thanks so much to subscribers. Thanks for subscribing. I hope you're getting what you want out of this. If there's anything else you want to see, put down questions, comments down below, or any other practices you have along these lines. I'd be interested to hear. Thanks so much to my patrons over on Patreon. If you want to join us and help out the channel and help out the work that all of us, I think, are doing in expanding these ideas, take a look at my Patreon page. It's linked down below. And I hope we will see you all on the next one of these videos and down in the comments and maybe over on Patreon. So thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, be well.